So let's start. This is the first in a series of 6 lectures that I'm giving loosely on the theme of architecture and philosophy. And I won't say much about the series itself because I'll save that for tomorrow, except to say that it's going to be the same time every evening. I just wanted to mention, though, that in terms of theory, there will be, as every year, a theory prize, the Mark Cousins Theory Award, which we will be giving at the closing ceremony on the 29th of July. That is after the main workshops, the main online workshops that take place right after the Digital Futures China workshops. There'll be a series of these workshops in 6 different languages. And today, they've just been, registration is just opened. Not all the information is up yet, but most of it is. And registration will be there from the 17th of June until the 1st of July. So please feel free to sign up for these workshops. There are very, very talented individuals, including from Zaha Hadid Architects, from some of the leading universities in the world, from the AA, from Harvard, and so on. So I want to start, though, really by giving a kind of comment on our contemporary condition, this very, very moment in history, which I think is hugely significant. Now, it's not a comment that relates directly to the kind of material I'll be talking about, although I do touch on this, but it's more a comment about the moment that we've reached. And I think it's very significant, and it has an impact on how we look at theoretical debates. I want to start off with a video that I found the other day by Arthur C. Clarke, who actually was British, and he was a futurist. And this is something comment he made in 1964, which I think is hugely prescient, astonishingly prescient.
However, the most intelligent inhabitants of that future world won't be men or monkeys. They'll be machines, the remote descendants of today's computers. Now, the present-day electronic brains are complete morons, but this will not be true in another generation. They will start to think, and eventually they will completely outthink their makers. Is this depressing? I don't see why it should be. We superseded the Cro-Magnon and Neanderthal men, and we presume we're an improvement. I think we should regard it as a privilege to be stepping stones to higher things. I suspect that organic or biological evolution has about come to its end, and we're now at the beginning of inorganic or mechanical evolution, which will be thousands of times swifter.
Now, what was so remarkable about that statement, and frankly, I would have said he was wrong until a few days ago, the idea that computers can think. Typically, we assume they can't think. At least up until now, we felt that. Computers are not sentient, they're not self-aware, they have no consciousness. They might be able to beat us at games of Go and chess, but they don't know that they're playing games of Go and chess. They have no more capacity to think than a pocket calculator has. At least that was a statement that I made in my book that was published at the beginning of last year. But the question now is whether that holds true anymore. Now I want to play you another video. This time it's going to be a video from Geoffrey Hinton, who hit the headlines famously just recently by resigning from Google and speaking out about his concerns about AI. Geoffrey Hinton, for those who don't know, he's described as the godfather of AI. I would say he's the godfather of deep learning rather than the godfather of AI, because he's the one who's been pushing deep learning, pushing neural networks, pushing connectionism during the period when it was out of favor. In fact, many people were extremely negative towards that approach. At one stage, the only way any papers published was by concealing any reference to neural networks. But he pushed it. He kept going with it. His background, he's British, he studied at Cambridge, he went to do a PhD at the University of Edinburgh, where he was interested in neuroscience. He's interested in how the mind works. And almost his work in AI is an extension of that. And because he had an interest in neuroscience, he was really interested in modeling AI on the brain, on neural networks. As an approach, as I said, that has been out of favor for years, but he stuck with it. And about 2006, that's when what we call the deep learning revolution began. And all of a sudden, because of faster and more powerful computers, because of much more data available, suddenly these systems worked. And right now, everything we've got, like ChatGPT, all these sort of online platforms, these diffusion platforms like Midjourney and DALL-E, they're all powered by deep learning. It is thanks to Geoff Hinton that we have all these things. In fact, particularly as regards to images, he was the one who made the breakthrough in 2012 in the ImageNet competition, showing how deep learning could recognize images much better than others. Anyway, this is Geoff Hinton, and he's talking about his concerns right now. So I'll just let him speak and then maybe say something afterwards.
It made me realize that these digital intelligences have something we don't have that makes them much better. When one of them knows something, it can tell all the others that's what we don't have with people. So imagine you had 10,000 people, and imagine if when one person learned something, everybody knew it. You could learn a lot more stuff, right? And that's why things like ChatGPT knows like 10,000 times as much as any one person. It's because when you train it, there's lots of different copies looking at different bits of the data and learning stuff, and they can all combine what they learn instantly with a bandwidth of like trillions of bits.
So can they think?
Yes. So imagine the following scenario. I'm talking to a chatbot, and we talk for a bit, and the answers it's giving me seem a bit strange to me. And I suddenly realize that it thinks I'm a teenage girl. And I say, what demographic do you think I am? And it says it thinks I'm a teenage girl. So the question is, when I said I suddenly realized it thinks I'm a teenage girl. Was that a metaphorical use of the word think? Or was that just the same way as we use think? And I strongly believe that use of the word think, when I said it thinks I'm a teenage girl, was exactly the same way of using think as we do with people.
And so that was enough to make you say, what, this has accelerated beyond my comfort level?
I suddenly realized maybe they already are better, and making them more like real neural nets isn't the point. They're already better than us. They're a better way of doing learning. And if we make them bigger, they'll get much smarter than us. They already know more than any one person.
I understand that things could go awry, but I still think that people hear the notion of danger and they dismiss it as hyperbole.
I thought it was hyperbole for a long time because I thought these things were a long way off. I thought there will eventually be danger, but I thought focusing on it now is unnecessary because it'll be 30 to 50 years before these things get more intelligent than us. But this combination of realizing that they might have a much better way of learning than we have because they can share knowledge instantly, and seeing things like ChatGPT or Palm at Google that can explain why a joke is funny, made me realize these things are already pretty intelligent. And if they've got a better form of intelligence than ours, then it gets to be much more urgent.
So what you get out of this is, first of all, he's saying they're intelligent. Now, that also was a question that we were raising until recently. If you can't think, how can you be intelligent? How can you learn? But what Geoffrey Hinton's claiming is they can think. And elsewhere, he makes a comment, they have a form of intelligence that is very different to human intelligence, not the same as human intelligence, but it is superior. Now, this is important because what it means basically is that if we're talking about theory, which is about thinking and critical thinking, we need to revise our attitudes. So far, there's been a huge divide in terms of architecture between the kind of the arts and the sciences, and a huge divide. And many people from the world of theory do not buy into these technologies, with the exception possibly of a few historians like Antoine Picon or Mario Carpa, but very few actual theorists, maybe Manuel Delanda being one. There has almost been a blockage. The people who work in theory want to deny technology for reasons I myself don't understand. But it seems to me, in terms of theory, we need to begin to open up beyond that. We need to engage between the world of philosophy, the world of cultural studies, the art side of things, and the world of technology via neuroscience. It seems to me neuroscience is the theoretical paradigm that has to be explored now in the world of architecture. So this is a crucial moment. It's forcing theorists to radically rethink what it is to think. And that seems to me remarkable. And what's also clear is that we're getting a kind of convergence between the world of not only arts and science, and people are beginning to think together, as it were, and that's what computation means, to think together from the Latin. But also we're getting a kind of a collaboration or a synergy between the world of the corporate world of technology companies like Google and the world of academia. It's a moment, an astonishing moment in which everything, a watershed moment in which everything is changing. Now, I want to set that down as a kind of marker that will inform this debate, this series. We need to rethink what we mean by theory itself. And everybody knows about this now because of the popularity of ChatGPT. Before, those who were working in AI knew about the potential of AI, but nobody else did. What's happened is not only has the general public found out about AI, but those who are working in AI have been surprised by the performance, the efficiency of technologies such as ChatGPT, Midjourney, DALL-E, and so on. I now just want to play you, just for a bit of fun, Snoop Dogg commenting actually on Geoffrey Hinton. He talks about him as the old dude, and ChatGPT.
Got AI right now. They say they made for they can talk to me. I'm like we can hold a real conversation. Like for real, like it's blowing my mind because I watched movies on this as a kid years ago when I just see this shit. And I'm like, what is going on? And I heard the old dude that created AI talking about this is not safe because the AI has got their own minds and they gonna start doing their own shit. I'm like, is we movie right now? Man, so do I need to invest in the AI so I can have one with me? Like, do y'all know shit? I'm lost. I don't know.
So the old dude was Geoffrey Hinton. It's almost, if talking of movies, as though we are in the Matrix, in a kind of a culture of simulation. And this is a kind of introduction in some sense to what we talk about today, about reality. And what you can see, this is an excerpt from the Matrix, and this is a clip of Baudrillard himself, Jean Baudrillard, the theorist who will be at the kind of the starting point in some ways of what we're talking about, is that you can see there's a reference in the movie, in the Matrix, to a book by Baudrillard, Simulacra and Simulations. Now, interestingly, Baudrillard himself was rather skeptical about the movie. There is the book, Simulacra and Simulations by Baudrillard. He was skeptical about the movie because he thought it got it wrong. There is no choice between the red pill and the blue pill. We cannot escape our condition, a condition that he describes as hyperreality. So he was actually invited to be part of the sequel to that. He didn't take part of it. But the comments that he was making somehow begin to resonate in a way in our contemporary age in a particular way. Are we living in the Matrix? All the questions, in fact, that come from the Matrix, how are we to answer them in our contemporary cultural condition? Is this real? This isn't real. What is real? How do you define real? These are the questions that I will be addressing today. And it's set in the context of some previous work that I've been doing on the culture of images. Architectural culture is unquestionably obsessed with images. And what I'm trying to do in this course is not only examine the implications of this through the lens of contemporary technology, but also attempting to find connections or resituate these debates in the context of new technologies, not only AI, but AR, VR, interactive design, the metaverse, and so on. So I'll talk more about this next week, tomorrow rather, but it'll be based on rethinking or revisiting these two books that I produced, The Anesthetics of Architecture back in 1999, and Camouflage that came out in 2006. The Anesthetics was hugely successful. It came out in 6 different languages, but a rather slim and book compared to the Camouflage, which maybe was too theoretical for a culture more interested, shall we say, in images. One of the books, The Anesthetics of Architecture, takes a critical view on the role of images, and Camouflage, in a far more nuanced and dialectical way, takes a more positive view towards the role of the images. So the first two lectures will be drawing upon material, the anesthetics, and the final four looking at camouflage. And these are the list of lectures. So the first two, reality and aestheticization, will be based on anesthetics, and then these final four will be based on camouflage. So today's will be the theme will be reality itself. You can see here, this is all the images in the posters are all AI generated images that themselves have become quite shocking. And alongside, I think what Geoffrey Hinton's pointing out about ChatGPT, I think we're all amazed how proficient Midjourney, DALL-E, and so on have now become. So the question I want to start with, or the question that underpins everything, what is reality? Can we even access reality? Or are we living in some matrix-like situation? Now, that might seem perverse to you. You might think, of course we can. Of course we're living in reality. I want to at least challenge that. I think that's the role of theory, to call into question received views and challenge them. So I want to start then with something that really made me suspicious about reality many years ago. An advertisement for Coca-Cola that is described as the real thing. I hope you can hear this sound of this video because I can't link it up to my laptop at this time. It's a real thing. That made me suspicious about reality. And I've got to say, if ever you hear someone using the term reality, or indeed the term or authenticity, be very suspicious. There are a lot of very conservative architects and architectural thinkers like Wilfred Wang who resort to this term. But the question is always, whose reality? Whose authenticity? I don't buy into that old-fashioned thinking myself. So just to sort of say, this question about what is reality has a long history in philosophy and culture itself, going back to Plato and surely even further. And this I'm showing here an illustration describing the allegory of the cave that appears in Plato's Republic, Book 10, a book that I studied when I was at school in England. And what you get in this allegory of the cave is essentially Plato describing essentially what people are normally like. That we are normally, in fact, in the original story, you are chained to a chair and you are looking at what you take to be reality. But actually, that reality is merely a shadow of something, an image of something. Here is the fire. Here is the thing that creates the shadow. And when we see this bird, we think we're looking at reality, but we're not. And according to Plato, it is the task of the philosophy to unchain us, to unbond us, to take us out of the cave into the daylight, as it were, where initially we start blinking because of the amount of light, but eventually we can see things as they actually are. And this theme of reality just being an illusion, being based on images and not being reality itself, is something we have a constant refrain throughout the history of philosophy, including Descartes, as we will see shortly. And of course, that notion that somehow we're not seeing the reality plays into the logic of virtual reality today. These people wearing this virtual reality headgear are, as it were, chained in the cave, very similar to the allegory that Plato talks about. So I'm going to touch upon a number of significant thinkers from a range of different backgrounds who have really challenged our understanding of reality. Many of them, apart from Guy Debord and Jean Baudrillard, have actually appeared on Digital Futures. We have a session on Baudrillard. Baudrillard himself died in 2007. And they offer each a particular take that collectively forces us to really question the world of reality. So I'm going to start with Guy Debord, who Baudrillard is really the kind of the springboard, but I want to start with Guy Debord because Guy Debord came before Baudrillard. I once went to a lecture by Baudrillard at the Institute of Contemporary Arts, ICA in London, and someone asked this rather naive question from the audience. Your thinking reminds me of Guy Debord. Do you know about him? And Baudrillard said, of course. No, I had huge respect for the work of Debord. and I followed him, and I thought that his work was remarkable, but things have got worse. What he was talking about in the 60s, the situation has been exacerbated. So in 1967, he published in French, the French version, so La Société du Spectacle, the Society of the Spectacle, which was a radical critique of contemporary culture, of oculocentric, of the obsession with images in contemporary culture. And the first line of the whole thing actually kind of gives it all away. And when he means spectacle, he doesn't mean glasses. He means, it's a French word, spectacle, which means images, spectacular images. The whole presents itself as an immense accumulation of spectacles. Now, this is an important thing. All that was once directly lived has become mere representation. Now, it is not talking about reality becoming representation so much as lived experience being replaced by representation. In other words, there's something that has been lost in our contemporary condition, and he connects it not only to the kind of the culture of oculocentrism, but also to the kind of commodification of everyday life that existed at the time. Now, this book had a huge impact on French society. It was, of course, a radical critique that went to the heart of society in the 60s. This is an advertisement for Kodak camera, and j'aime ma caméra parce que j'aime vivre. I love my camera because I love to live. It's as though we couldn't see ourselves except through the lens of the camera, as though we were to be featured in Paris Match or one of those glossy magazines. And as such, according to Debord, we became alienated from our true selves. Debord, as a Marxist thinker, is obsessed with the question of alienation. And because of this culture which we were saturated by images, images had replaced lived experience, we were somehow alienated from our true selves. This led to a number of different things. Soon after that book was published, in some senses, it became a kind of manifesto for the events of May 68, the moment in Paris when the students from the Sorbonne took to the streets and protested against this condition, against the commodification of everyday life. And it's a thing that spread to all the workers in the factories outside of Paris and led to the downfall of de Gaulle's government. General de Gaulle, the president at the time, just couldn't understand what they were talking about, and that led to that. It also led to a kind of watershed moment in French intellectual life. This is when Michel Foucault, when Derrida, when Deleuze, then Hélène Cixous, when Julia Kristeva, and so on, all came to the fore. It was a moment that really there was a kind of birth of an incredibly progressive intellectual tradition that had a huge impact across the world. And here they are, the kind of students protesting, throwing cobbles on the street, and then the mottos they daubed. Underneath the pavements is the beach, this was an incredible moment. But of course, it wasn't just confined to France. The idea of kind of cultural uprising and changes was a kind of universal thing. Here we have students in California putting flowers in rifles, protesting against the Vietnam War. It was a moment of radical upheaval. Make love, not more, not war. Smoke ganja, not guns. And you can see this is actually right by where I live in Venice Beach. You can see this. And of course, it was also, to some extent, in Eastern Europe. This is the Prague Spring, the uprising that took place in what was then Czechoslovakia, now the Czech Republic, when they rebelled against the Soviet occupation of the Eastern Bloc. For a brief-lived moment, there was a moment of liberation. And this is when Dalibor Vesely came from Czech Republic to England and went to go and teach at the Cambridge and the Architectural Association. It was also a moment that we went from the Beatles in the UK through to the Sex Pistols, God Save the Queen. It was a moment of radical change, not just in music, but also in art, in fashion, and so on. The 60s was really an astonishing decade when we saw all sorts of changes. And what is interesting about the world of art is the way in which somehow a critique of the spectacle showed how the spectacle itself could be unraveled by the spectacle. In other words, the world of the visual, the world of art itself, and here Cindy Sherman's photography could be used to challenge the whole logic of what the society of the spectacle lived for. And importantly, I want to go back to this because the way in which it talks about contemporary conditions of production, it is talking about capitalism. It is talking about the commodification of culture. And we can see how far-reaching this is when you can see the more recent sort of work that be coming out that is criticizing. Money can't buy you love. To my mind, this is probably probably a take on the Beatles. Money can't buy you love. And you could see how this radical feminist critique was taking to the world of art itself, critique of the kind of obsession about the monitoring, the surveillance of the body, and this idea of I shop, therefore I am, a kind of a take on Descartes, who said, I think, therefore I am. And it wasn't just simply that shopping was a kind of therapy, retail therapy as it's called, and people became obsessed with shopping itself, but also it's sort of, in some senses, it was about identity. It wasn't just about the shoes, but precisely what shoes and how you would, in some sense, brand yourself. So this particular advertisement, and of course, the spectacle was all about advertisement, all about branding. This particular advertisement for Usain Bolt and Puma, the point is this, it's as though if you wear a Puma shoes, you yourself will run as fast as Usain Bolt. It's almost like they're magically invested with this potential to allow you to do it. You could wear Adidas like David Beckham and play football or soccer as well as David Beckham and so on. And you can see this also in the way that cars were portrayed, typically with a very sexist way, with women being used to advertise them. But the point is this, these guys driving these BMWs, it's not just simply they're attracted to it because they're associated with a good-looking woman. They somehow think that if they drive a car like this, they're going to attract a good-looking woman to come and sit in the seat beside them. It's as though this permeated the whole of society, that we became lost in this dream-filled sleep, as Walter Benjamin described it, and it permeated everything. It was about consumerism, it was about commodification, it was about brands, it was about losing the sense of who we are and buying into this corporate culture. I am a human being, not a commodity. And of course, we saw this played out in more recent sort of demonstrations about Occupy Wall Street. I'm not sure that we're any alternative to capitalism. You hear architectural professors ranting against capitalism. I'm not quite sure how an architecture professor is going to change capitalism. There is no space outside capitalism, as Frederick Jameson famously pointed out. But nonetheless, it's important to recognize that it is not working in the sense that it privileges the rich and the poor are losing out. And that seems to be a divide that is getting even worse. So it's against that backdrop, that radical backdrop of Guy Debord, the situation as this kind of movement that was challenging the way that we think, that Jean Baudrillard can be understood. Baudrillard, who saw the situation that had been portrayed by Debord and said it got worse. For Baudrillard, we've now moved into what he calls the third order of simulation. The first order being when we were in touch with reality. The second moment when, in terms of Debord, we lost a sense of reality because it was being obscured by this culture of images. And now this third order, when we reach this moment, a moment of simulacra and simulation, but what Baudrillard calls hyperreality. Hyperreality is this moment when we have utterly lost touch with reality. We are marooned in some hyperspace without any connection with the real world itself. And that, for Baudrillard, was the condition we entered into roughly through the 1980s, a condition that he famously described as hyperreality. Hyperreality has also been used by Umberto Eco, but in a very, very different way. And Umberto Eco, offering also a critique of American culture, was talking about the hyperrealism of visual realism of hyperreality. This notion of hyperreality was utterly different. It's talking about how we effectively have lost touch with reality itself. Now, there's a session on this, which I will refer you to, that is in our Digital Futures library, where we had Graham Gillick and Francesco Proto, who's written 2 books on Baudrillard and architecture. So this was the book that appeared, Simulacra and Simulation, that appeared in the Matrix, that in some senses kind of kicked it all off. It was quite an early book in terms of what Baudrillard's own work, and he went on to elaborate a variety of other kind of of positions. Baudrillard, I should say, was a sociologist, a cultural theorist, a kind of philosopher of sorts. He didn't hold a permanent academic position, but he was hugely successful with his books. I guess he survived from that. But what he would deploy in his writing, which I always found very accessible because he would use metaphors from everyday life, washing machines and so on, to explain everything and how things were operating. But what he deployed was a particular, what he called fatal strategy. What he means by fatal strategy, basically, is when you're talking about something, you kind of exaggerate it in order to get your point across. So what you're saying is less a representation of the world, so much as a transcendence of that. And this appeared in many of his writings. For example, this book, The Perfect Crime. In The Perfect Crime is the theft of reality. And that's really one of his obsessions, that reality itself has been stolen. Has it been stolen? Well, certainly the title would make you think that. And then there was perhaps this outrageous book that came out, that it was based on a series of articles. He wrote before the Gulf War took place. He wrote an article that appeared in a prominent French newspaper, The Gulf War will not take place. And once the Gulf War started taking place, he wrote another article, The Gulf War is not taking place. And then he followed it up after the Gulf War had finished with a final article, The Gulf War did not take place. And these were assembled together in a book, The Gulf War did not take place. And according to some people, this was the worst. This was some critical responses was this was the worst example of postmodern hermeneutics. Of course, had he been there, he would have known that the Gulf War had taken place with the bombs falling all around him. But in many ways, I think Baudrillard's point actually makes a lot of sense. In a way, as far as the Western television audience was concerned, where they're watching TV and they're flicking between different channels, between basketball matches and advertisements and Gulf War things, did it really take place except as a kind of media spectacle? And what's more, when you think about it, the Gulf War was all about trying to preserve access to oil. Meanwhile, another war was happening, another part of the world, East Timor, where there was enormous genocide going on. But it was in the West's interest to keep quiet about that. So we never heard about East Timor, but we did hear about the Gulf War precisely because of the oil. So you can see, and so I have a certain sympathy with Baudrillard's view. But it's an architectural emblem, icon, that Baudrillard uses to talk about this world of hyperreality, this condition in which we found ourselves, marooned in hyperspace, out of touch with anything in the real world. And he uses Disneyland to explain it. Disneyland purports to show us an imaginary kingdom, a magical castle that is, as it were, set apart from the world outside. And as such, it kind of somehow becomes a prop to reality, as it were. It makes us think that the world outside is real, whereas in fact it's hyperreal. But one could even sort of take some of the logic of Disneyland, the logic of theming and role-playing of Mickey Mouse and so on, and realize that itself has become all-pervasive. In other words, what we find out is actually Disneyland, far from being remote and separate from the world outside, is precisely a condensation of all the values of America and thereafter the West, of course. Disneyland appeared in many other countries. It was an example of that. It was an example of the extreme saturation of capitalism, the exploitation. Every time you go to Disneyland, you'll come away realizing that you spent a lot of money simply taking part of that. Disneyland, though, is not simply, the corollary of that is not just simply that Disneyland is really part of the world outside. It's also that the world outside is part of Disneyland. It follows on from that logic. The role-playing logic you get from advertising that I was showing, that's precisely part of that. And also, when you look at the kind of the way our cultural heritage has been treated, and this is something I think that Raymond Koolhaas also talks about, how our city centres begin to sort of celebrate their cultural heritage. They become a kind of theme park themselves. This advertisement, which is clearly a lot outdated because there's Concorde here flying, and it was soon put out of service because Concorde crashed roughly around there, and it was became obsolete. But this image, at the time, I thought was absurd that somehow they put Disneyland as though it was the equivalent of the Arc de Triomphe, Eiffel Tower, and Notre Dame on the same map, along with also with Fontainebleau and Versailles, the real castles, as it were, of the Loire and so on. But when you think about it, the point is this actually represents it very well, because actually these places have all become a kind of Disneyland, a kind of commodified touristic experience that we kind of buy into. So when we go to this kind of this Chateau on the Loire, we don't actually engage with the, as it were, reality of the chateau. And who knows what the history was? Let me just assume that maybe the person who commissioned this chateau had possibly made money out of the slave trade and so on. Who knows what? All that is somehow kind of has been washed aside, and we go there for our commodified touristic experience and to have our picnic on out there in the weekend, and we've lost touch with what that really all stood for. And this critique then that Baudrillard offers of a world of hyperreality, I'm not going to pursue this right now, but just I will leave it with you to think about, well, how does it kind of feed into the world of virtual reality? How can we learn the lessons or think through the lessons of hyperreality and link them to virtual reality itself? Well, what was the problem with Baudrillard? Well, in some senses, the problem would be that he had a kind of nostalgic view of the world. I once heard a theory that everything that was written was either about paradise that had been lost or paradise to come. And this idea that somehow there was a lost paradise, there was a paradise when we were in touch with reality, I don't think that holds water. I'm not sure that is the case at all. When was this moment when we were completely connected? Was it back in the moment of the slave trade when we had slaves? Was it back before women had the vote? Was it back when there was prejudice rife within society? I don't see that moment actually existing. So I think this is one of the kind of problems, in a sense, with Baudrillard's thinking. We could also use the idea that comes from psychoanalysis, and we'll talk about this in a moment, that actually we never have access to reality in the first place. So Baudrillard then is a kind of like an interesting figure from that point of view. He raises some interesting questions. He becomes a provocateur, but then we can sound out against more recent commentators. And I'm going to just mention David Chalmers, somebody who I think last year published this book, Reality, or was it the year before? Reality Plus, the Virtual Worlds and the Problems of Philosophy. David Chalmers appeared talking about this book on digital futures in one of our series on AI, neuroscience, and architecture that was also part of the Doctoral Consortium initiative. And we brought together a series of really significant figures. And what is interesting, of course, about the world of, let's say, AI is that you get a connection between philosophers such as David Chalmers, who are experts in consciousness, and also those neuroscientists such as Anil Seth, who are also experts in consciousness. So this field brings it all together. Anyway, this is a book that Chalmers has published, where essentially what he's talking about in terms of virtual reality is it's a book I think that a lot of architects will be interested in, especially if they work in the realm of VR. He basically, his argument, central argument, is actually virtual worlds are in a sense as real for us as reality itself. But I'm going to show you a little of him discussing the kind of the model of the matrix as a model for understanding how we operate. And again, I just hope that the videos, you can hear this well enough from my laptop.
The matrix and the metaverse. I'll start with the last one. We might be in virtual reality already, and one version of this is the idea that we could be living in a giant computer simulation, such as the Matrix. For some reason, I'm losing control over my slides. Yeah, there we go. Okay, here's a scene from the Matrix. This is the Oracle and Trinity talking to each other, both hanging out in this giant simulation, the Matrix. The Oracle and Trinity are actually interestingly different. Trinity is a biological creature plugged in to the simulation. The Oracle is a machine, herself a creature of the simulation. So Trinity is what I call a biosim, biology connected to a simulation. The Oracle is a pure sim, illustrated here by the brain and the computer. This is two different ways of being in a simulation, both of which I think are open hypotheses for us now. I could be a biosim, a brain connected to a simulation. I could be a pure sim. All this could be simulated. And this is wonderful for a philosopher because it's a kind of an up-to-date illustration of ideas that go back to ancient Chinese philosophy. Zhuangzi saying, am I a Zhuangzi who just dreamed he was a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming that he's Zhuangzi? Well, here's Descartes sitting by his fire. Descartes in his Meditations from 1640 says, I seem to be just here sitting by the fire with a paper in my hand and a dog at my feet. and so on. But how do I know any of that is actually happening? Here we have a modern illustration of that. Well, actually, it turns out Descartes is in VR, and the paper, the fire, the dog, all of that was just produced by the VR. So VR technologies provided a way of making these Cartesian challenges, somewhat more realistic. Here's a more futuristic version of. Well, I thought I was going to have a version with the brain in a vat, but here we go. The brain in a vat. Very good. So here's Descartes' evil demon running the simulation. Descartes said, "How do I know an evil demon isn't fooling me into thinking that there's a world out there when none of it is real?" And here we have the evil demon using high-tech technology to produce this impression for the brain, which still gets to think, I think, therefore I am. I know that I exist, but does the rest of the world exist? Anyway, so in the first part of the book, I argue that we can't rule out the simulation hypothesis, that it could be. I don't say we are all in a simulation, but it's certainly consistent with all of our evidence. But it's kind of a bad news, good news story. Bad news, we might be in a simulation. Good news, simulations are actually a form of reality, on my view. This is contrary to a very common view that computer simulations are illusions. Virtual reality is illusory reality. I want to say computer simulations are genuine reality. Even if we are in a simulation, and I could be, all this is still real. The cats, the dogs, the tables and chairs, the people, the planet, all these things are real. They're digital creatures, but no less real for all that. Here is Cornel West expressing I think the common view that if you're in a simulation, it's an illusion. Because Cornel West himself appeared in the movies as Counselor West of Zion, who I'm thinking was originally in the Matrix, got out to Zion, then comes out to US where he's Cornel West, and then Cornel West says, but it's illusions all the way down. Maybe even this one is an illusion, as suggested by the wires there on the left. So this is great for a philosopher because it raises so many deep questions about reality, illustrated by another illustration from the Matrix. Neo says, this isn't real. And Morpheus says, what is real? How do you define real? And I would argue that even if we're in a digital simulation, objects in the simulation count as just as real as objects in a physical world. They're out there, independent of us. They make a difference. They have causal powers in the world. They exist, and they needn't be illusions. So that's something I try and argue in the book. Here's a picture I think this picture kind of sums up my vision for the book, that digital reality is genuine reality. You can really create genuine worlds using computer simulations, using VR technology. This is a vision of this picture actually represents God creating the universe, and but here God is a teenage hacker in the next universe up, and she's programming a computer. God says, "Let there be bits," and a whole reality spurs into existence, a genuine reality. Here's another picture of it. There's a traditional God on the left, a relatively traditional one, who creates a physical reality, but one that's made of bits. This is the so-called "it from bit" idea. Objects in reality are made of bits, and God creates the bits, and the tables and chairs are made of the bits. On the right, we have the simulator doing very much the same thing, programming a computer, arrange the bits, and then if that's what happened to us, then by arranging these bits, the simulator brought tables and chairs and trees and dolphins and so on into existence. So reality in a computer simulation, reality may be made of bits, but it's no less real for all that. I like this because it's like a creation myth for the information age. This is how gods do their work. They don't say, let there be lights. They say, let there be bits.
Okay. Well, that idea that there is a reality and the virtual reality can be reality is in some senses the opposite view to that taken by Slavoj Žižek. And Žižek is somebody I find enormously provocative. He was the first person, of course, to give a lecture in this series, the Doctoral Consortium series on architecture and philosophy. And here he is. I got to say that this was a roundtable discussion in Zagreb in 2008. It was actually the anniversary, the 40th anniversary of May 68. That was what it's all about. And I was in this roundtable discussion also with a convicted murderer who had a German guy who had held up these German embassy in Sweden, trying to get the Baader-Meinhof gang released. If there's one thing more terrifying than being in a roundtable discussion with a convicted murderer, it's being in a roundtable discussion with Slavoj Žižek, probably the sharpest mind on the planet. Anyway, he wrote a very interesting article, which I reprinted in a book, Designing for a Digital World, back in 2002, from years ago, from the days when virtual reality wasn't about wearing headgear, but rather looking at a screen. But as a Lacanian, Jacques Lacan was, as you probably know, was a psychoanalytic thinker who was, I guess, the next most significant name after Sigmund Freud. And Lacan's view is that we never access reality, reality with a capital R, except in moments of what he calls jouissance, and we'll talk about that in one of the sessions to come. But what we take for reality is, in fact, the imaginary. And what effectively what Žižek is doing here is challenging this the dichotomy that we tend to have between fantasy and reality. And what he's saying is that basically, if you take a Lacanian perspective, you never engage with reality. Rather, you see it through the lens of fantasy. You fantasize about what it is you're looking at. You're kind of trying to guess what it is in some senses. Far from being a figment of our dreams that prevents us from seeing reality as it effectively is, fantasy is constitutive of what we call reality. The most commonly bodily reality is constituted via a detour through the maze of the imagination. In other words, reality doesn't come to us. It's not that there isn't something out there, a material world, there is, but the way that we engage with this is in some senses filtered through the maze of our imagination. Fantasy is constitutive of how we see reality. We never escape fantasy. So the interesting kind of lesson he comes up with is that the idea actually virtual reality itself gives us a model by which to understand how we engage with reality. The ultimate lesson of virtual reality is the virtualization of the very true reality. In other words, the lesson of virtual reality is not how virtual reality is, but rather how virtual reality itself is. Let me say that again, because it's a bit complex to understand. The lesson of virtual reality is not that how virtual reality is, rather how virtual reality itself is. And that, I think, is a fundamentally and hugely insightful comment that needs to be taken on board. So let's move on to Joshua Bach, somebody who's also an interesting figure because he's a descendant of Bach, the musician, but he's a neuroscientist and AI specialist from Germany, now working in California, and one of the most interesting figures in the world when it comes to these things. Now, Bach takes the view that we are living in a kind of form of simulation. And we also had him on Digital Futures, Digital Futures, the Doctoral Consortium times FIU DDES, where he was, I mean, the most popular ever Digital Futures session, I think, certainly in terms of viewing figures, enormously provocative thinker. And let me just play this out to you, because I think this is amazing, the way in which he, in some, well, let me just play it for you.
And this what I've highlighted, I think it's really an interesting and incredibly provocative sort of comment. Basically, a brain cannot feel anything, a neuron cannot feel anything. They're physical things. Physical systems are unable to experience anything, but it would be very useful for the brain or for the organism to know what it would be like to be a person and to feel something. So the brain creates a simulacrum of such a person that it uses to model the interactions of the person. It's the best model of what that brain, this organism, thinks it is in relationship to its environment. So it creates that model. It's a story, a multimedia novel that the brain is continuously writing and updating. I mean, I find this enormously provocative as a kind of as a comment. I think the idea that we're kind of creating a story that somehow gives meaning to something it kind of reminds me in some sense of the way that Homi Bhabha talks about how a nation operates. I think Zizek says something similar. It's how things are inscribed within a story that people tell oneself, and I think that's important because in architecture we just focus on the object, but actually it's the way that object is inscribed within some subjective process that makes it make sense of things. But I just wonder so to my mind, this is an incredibly provocative and controversial comment, it seems. Just maybe could you comment on the reception that this view has had with other people? Has it proved to be controversial?
How else could it be? Do you have another theory that works, that can explain what's going on? I think it's once I noticed that my own experience is virtual, that my memories are often recreated or created after the fact and modified under my nose without me noticing. You would notice that you exist inside of a model. It's also that I'm not in physical time. My own self is sometimes a little bit ahead of the universe, the physical universe, sometimes a little bit behind. And usually both. So the physical now and the experience now are different. And the elements of my perception are clearly not the elements in which physics is being implemented. Rather, it's the other way around. What I notice is that I do exist in a dream, very much like we usually say in idealist philosophy. But this dream needs to be created somehow. Something needs to construct the dream. And that's a brain in a higher plane of existence. And this higher plane of existence is what we call physics.
Maybe I'll just stop.
So what I find interesting about this is, the standard, the view of David Chalmers about what is consciousness, David Chalmers talks about it as some kind of video of ourselves that's been played out in which we play the central central role. What Yoshua Bach is suggesting is actually we are creating this in order to make meaning out of the universe. In other words, the universe itself has no meaning. It's simply Brownian motion and so on. And likewise, the brain itself has got, it's just got neurons. It has no sense of this. So we construct this narrative. We construct this narrative to make sense of things. And just to be clear, AI is a world in which there is no meaning. Humans, by contrast, are meaning-making machines. And one can therefore sort of see how religion and all that is very much kind of human invention to try and make sense of the universe. I won't go down there because it's an amazing, interesting, provocative area. But let me just move on to the world of Anil Seth, who is somebody who I think likes is very fond of Yoshua, but isn't completely convinced by everything that he says, but he's nonetheless he respects him. And Anil Seth is another person that we've had on Digital Futures, and one of the most extraordinary figures in the world of neuroscience. He works on consciousness. He has a connection with AI because his PhD was on AI, and whereas Geoffrey Hinton did a PhD on neuroscience and moved into AI, and the same goes for Demis Hassabis of DeepMind in London. He also did a PhD on neuroscience and went into AI. Anil Seth went the opposite direction. But what's very clear to me is that both neuroscientists and AI people are interested in the end, the same question. What is intelligence? This is a book that came out and has become a huge bestseller. He's also been responsible for a TED Talk that was probably the most important TED Talk, or one of the most successful TED Talks ever. 14 million or so people have watched it, and it is the most incredible TED Talk. I really would recommend it. But what I want to do here, though, is to try and to refer to his theory of our perception of reality as a form of controlled hallucination. The term hallucination, of course, has been used by Refik Anadol to describe the work that he's doing. This is an installation in New York that he called machine hallucination. But could the term hallucination, which has been used in different contexts and therefore presumably doesn't necessarily have much in common with each other, but could we interrogate that notion of hallucination in the context of AI to try and understand and unpick the way in which human beings themselves begin to operate? So this is the TED Talk. This is an old version because it has 10 million views, but he has been extremely popular with this. Now, the basic view of Anil Seth is that the brain is locked into a bony skull. It's in a dark place. There's almost no sound coming in. There's no light coming in. And what it relies upon are kind of very vague signals, electrical signals coming in from the outside world. And it's got to make sense of this. So one of his theories, a theory that Andy Clark, someone else we also had on Digital Futures, espouses, is the idea that somehow that we have perception is predictive. We try and predict what we're saying, what we're seeing, based on previous experiences of the world. And therefore, it is a kind of prediction based on previous things, not the world as it is, but that's our best guess about what is out there. And this I find a fascinating discourse. I won't show you the video because of copyright reasons, but let me just simply take you through some slides. All this puts the brain basis of perception in a bit of a different light. Instead of perception depending largely on signals coming into the brain from the outside world, it depends as much, if not more, on perceptual predictions flowing in the opposite direction. We don't just passively perceive the world. We actively generate it. The world we experience comes as much, if not more, from the inside out as from the outside in. Now, this is the central point. This is the central point behind all his work. If hallucination is a kind of uncontrolled perception, and you've got to think about this because it's not so obvious, if hallucination is a kind of uncontrolled perception, then perception right here and right now is also a kind of hallucination, but a controlled hallucination. So we are hallucinating the whole time. Our notion of perception is a controlled hallucination where things are being reined in and checked against the kind of the world as it is. And this is the central thesis. Perception is a form of controlled hallucination. But then he goes on to talk about how this connects with reality. In fact, we are all hallucinating all the time, including right now. It's just that when we agree about our hallucinations, we call that reality. In other words, we just call it reality, and it is based on a series of hallucinations. And these hallucinations are perceptual predictions about what is going on in the world outside, because the brain doesn't get much information, and all it can do is base it on previous experiences and offer its best guess. I think that thing up there is a car or whatever. Now that I find absolutely fascinating, but I just want to take this a little further and see how we can maybe use that to try and understand the mind of the architect. Can we use the world of AI, the world of neuroscience in some sense also, as a mirror by which to understand how we operate as architects or indeed designers or artists of any kind? Now, if you were to ask any school kid in the world, literally all over the world, how many colors there are in a rainbow, I guarantee they would say 7. At least they should say 7, because that's what they've been taught. There are 7 colors in a rainbow: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. That's what we're all taught. But actually, when you look at a rainbow, there's a complete spectrum of colors. Literally, there is an infinite number of colors in a rainbow. But nonetheless, we go about it and we pick out and say, oh, yes, there's the red, there's the orange, there's the yellow, there's the blue, there's the indigo, there's the violet, and so on. Because we have been trained exactly like a neural network to recognize that there are 7 colors in the rainbow. And the same goes for architectural education. We are taught, we are programmed in architectural education to think that this is what a functionalist building is like. And you know, this is the Villa Savoye by Le Corbusier. It's a kind of a white building with a flat roof on Pelotti, and that's what a functionalist building is. And we're trained to do that. And if we were an exam and people say, give us an example of a functionalist building, and if you present the Villa Savoye, you pass. But there's a problem there too. I mean, is it functionalist? I mean, first of all, it's got a flat roof. Now, if you come from the country that I come from the UK, it rains a lot, and there's absolutely nothing that is functional about a flat roof because they all leak. In other words, we find ourselves, and education is not about necessarily being open-minded and things, it's actually about being trained to think in a certain sort of way. This is a very, very beautiful video by Memo Acton, who is an artist now based in UC San Diego, who is actually testing out these ideas. The time he was writing, actually, he lived very close to Anil Seth, but never met him until we had a discussion on digital futures. And what he's doing here, you can see on the left-hand side, you can see a charger and keys and so on that are being put on the table. And on the right-hand side, we've got a series of neural networks or neural networks that have been trained on certain images. Here we see flowers. So when it, maybe you can go back. When it's, can I do that again? Or it can be trained on water. So here we see a cloth or something on the left, and it's reading that as though it is water, because that's a kind of perceptual prediction. He's trying to model exactly what Anil Seth's talking about. Here's another neural network that has been trained on fire, and it sees this charger and interprets it as flower, then the flowers and so on. In other words, what Memo Acton's doing is exactly the same thing. What we see out there is not reality, as it were. It's a perceptual prediction of what happens in the outside world. This also happens in architecture. This is a project that was done by a student of mine who did a very similar thing. Using cycle GANs, he trained the cycle GANs on a building by Zaha Hadid in Saudi Arabia, a research center. And on the left-hand side, as you'll see, you can see his wardrobe. In fact, there are two neural networks here. One is based on Zaha buildings, and one is based on downtown Miami of generic tower blocks. And what you can see is that on the left-hand side, his T-shirt becomes a Zaha design. And similarly, when we get to look at the city, his tie becomes, in a sense, a tower block. This, I think, is enormously provocative. It starts making you think about the gaze of the architect, and how that is not innocent either. Here's the tie and here's the tower block. And how we see the world that is, in a sense, filtered, but also predictive in some senses, and how we therefore potentially see buildings in everything that is around us. That begins to explain the logic of inspiration, that little everyday objects can inspire us to go and be, maybe that's a building, maybe this is that, maybe it's that, as though we're absorbing them and then re-articulating them as buildings themselves. I don't know. We can't prove this. This is simply an argument by analogy, but it's a very, very, I think, a very provocative one and a very interesting one to maybe pursue in some way. So this is the architectural equivalent, as it were, of Memo Acton, then also of Anil Seth. We see the world through predictive perceptions, not as it is. I've taken this further to introduce this notion of architecturalization, rather awkward term, but nonetheless a useful term. And we could see, for example, how Sydney Opera House, designed by Johan Utzon, at least the initial sketches, it got constrained more as the engineers had to go and resolve some of the forms. The actual sketches were inspired by the billowing sails of yachts in the harbour in Sydney Harbour. And that's a very literal expression of how architects can take a form and turn it into architecture. Now, also this works in a very negative way. You can see, for example, how in certain areas, these are two figures from the Bartlett, Gilles Retsin and Mario Carpa, and the mistakes they're making because they literally translate terminology into architectural form. The notion of the discrete, that Gilles Retsin read somewhere that the digital is discrete, and it is, but that doesn't mean discrete forms, but he translates this into discrete forms. Mario Carpa, in his book, The Second Digital Term, turns it reads somewhere that big data is messy. And he comes across this 3D printed chair, also by Gilles Retsin, and said that's a manifestation of the style of big data. Well, that's what you get when an historian who knows nothing about theory or anything about digital anything writes about these things. In fact, we know already that actually the world of AI, of big data, is not about form, it's about different forms of informational processes. So, for example, if you see an Uber car or a Didi car and ask yourself a question, is that any different to an ordinary car? Is it a new form of car? No, it looks exactly the same as an ordinary car,
precisely because it is an ordinary car. It is the way in which the information has been processed that makes it so different. We also see this in the world of let's say, architectural theory. Gilles Deleuze wrote a book called The Fold that architects, this is Greg Lynn, automatically think that maybe refer to folding in architecture, to blobs and so on. Actually, Gilles Deleuze was not talking about form at all. He was talking about subjectivities. And yet, this is in a sense what happens when architects interpret this. Perhaps the worst example was the world of deconstruction. The work of Jacques Derrida, the French post-structuralist thinker, philosopher, who coined the term. And he wasn't referring to architecture at all. He was talking about how we see the world in terms of a constructed understanding of the world, which is very similar in some sense to the world of neuroscience, to the world of Anil Seth, of how we think the world should be based on previous experiences. Now, the problem about our constructed way of looking at the world is that it contains certain biases, that male is privileged over female, practice over theory, and so on, and in some senses echoes the way in which AI operates in terms of bias. But architects saw the term deconstruction and assumed automatically that somehow he was talking about architecture, construction of some kind. And I won't go down that route, but there was a lot of misunderstandings going on between this, and it's fairly obvious what caused them. Architects were just misunderstanding this. They were architecturalizing the term deconstruction to see what it and using it as a kind of a prompt to start designing buildings. Let me refer now, just to almost finish off, it's the final session to finish off with Helen Sixou. Helen Sixou also that we've mentioned in our Digital Futures sessions. Doina Petrescu, who's a professor at the University of Sheffield, professor of architecture, took a PhD under her and a master's under Derrida in Paris. And Helen Sixou is very much in the same way of thinking. In other words, she belongs to this post-structuralist way of thinking, whereby we begin to sort of interpret things in our own way. Now, what is important for architectural culture is that we just simply, as I mentioned earlier, our problem is that we see a building as a building as a building as a building, as though it's not problematic. But the point is this, that actually we have to incorporate into that worldview a subjective lens, because that subjective lens effectively changes the way that we see the world, effectively makes it a different world. In one of my books, Architecture and Revolution, Helen produced an essay about Prague. And she talks about the many different forms of Prague, multiple Pragues, the Pragues you can't really capture. It's impossible to capture Prague because there are so many possible Pragues out there. It's not Pragues, not Prague, but Pragues in the plural. How do you understand Pragues? And she compares this to this Monet painting of Rouen Cathedral, and there are 20 different versions of this. I don't know how many of them are, but she says the truth, as it were, of Rouen Cathedral is not one of these. It's all of these all together. This is what we mean when we're talking about how we interpret the world of building, of architecture. And of course, most famously, we've come across this in this book by Italo Calvino, Invisible Cities. If you read the book, and I'm sure many of you have read the book, you'll see these 12 different chapters, each describing what sound like completely different cities. And then at the end, you find out that actually it's the same city, Venice, that is simply being described in different sort of ways. In other words, what is the reality of Venice? There's no such thing as a reality of Venice. There are, in some senses, realities in the plural. So maybe we could sort of finish with where we started in some senses with the Coca-Cola advert. There you go. Tomorrow we will look at the question of aestheticization and maybe be more close to the anesthetics book than today, because I only really referred to Debord and Baudrillard briefly in terms of that. And then for the final 4 sessions, we'll be looking at the camouflage book and trying to weave or relate this to the contemporary technological world in which we operate. a world of AI, a world of AR, of VR, a world of the metaverse, a world of interactive design, and so on. It seems to me that what we need to do, as I started off by saying, is bring together the worlds of arts and sciences so they can feed into one another. We can't no longer, it seems, now that we know that these machines are able to think in a way, some senses superior to us, just simply rely on our traditional beliefs and so on. So I'm gonna leave it there and open up to questions. I know that some people are following on Bilibili and some people are following on YouTube. So if I could, we also have a Zoom audience here. If I could ask someone to go and see if there are any questions coming in from YouTube or Bilibili, and we can take it from there. So I hope that made sense, and I hope that you're able to hear the sound from my laptop. Okay. I don't know whether anyone's able to, Xiao, is anyone able to actually talk and ask a question, or is it going to be, do they have to get permission to become a co-host to
Well, the one in the panelists, they can free to talk, and for the attendees, they can post their questions in the Q&A box.
Okay. So that means that the participants, the attendees can ask questions, yeah?
Yeah, they both can ask questions.
Okay.
But the panelists, they can just turn on their audio and to ask directly. And for the attendees, they need to post on the Q&A box.
Yeah. All right. Okay. So I'm open to questions. Typically, I don't get so many. Oh, here's a question already. Okay. Gustavo.
Yes, hello, Neil. Thank you very much for the wonderful lecture. And I just wanted to ask you, the way that you presented your narrative for the definition of reality or realities, how do you see reality changing over time now that we have more precise instrumentation? It sounds as though that this is about levels of detail as well in the scientific domain, but it's also contrasting our philosophical understanding of what historical reality is. How do you come to terms with that with our investigations of space as architects?
Well, I mean, maybe I could simply respond. Let me just respond first of all by saying that this was a kind of question in some senses I put to Joscha Bach and a few others, that in some ways, and also Anil Seth actually, that some of the speculations, shall we say, that came out of philosophy, particularly out of psychoanalysis, were actually quite close to the speculations you get in neuroscience, very, very close. But the problem is, of course, it's just speculation. When Freud says that he supposes we have an unconscious, it's no more than that. It's supposition. Now, it makes sense. It makes complete sense, but it's not proven in any way. So in some senses, we're on this week, the calibration of things, of instruments. I think the working method, shall we say, of people like Anil Seth, the neuroscientists, who are trying to find some kind of basis of evidence behind their suppositions. I didn't show you that today, but if you look at the TED Talk, you'll come across some glimpse of that. But if you read all his papers, there's a lot there, whereby they're trying to sort of methodologically sort of ground it in some kind of testing of some kind. Now, there's obviously a problem there. You know, there's a whole discourse about whether or not the scientific method actually makes sense. I won't go into that, but Paul Feyerabend and Thomas Kuhn and so on have always been debating this with people like Karl Popper about whether we can prove anything through science. But nonetheless, there is something quite reassuring when you get someone like Anil Seth really being rigorous in the way they're researching things. Having said that, well, I started off with Arthur C. Clarke, and you think, well, that was astonishing. He was a science fiction writer, yet incredible insights. So what was he basing that on? Was he basing on measuring anything, on scientific experiments, or what? Those kind of comments, and there are many others that he came up with, were just profound and astonishing. So there is a there's a kind of an idea that there's kind of a theory of fiction, shall we say, or it's the theory of science fiction would also inform what we're doing. I think Liam Young would probably come under that bracket of people who are kind of speculating in a very provocative way, but in some senses just commenting in some sense. How do you measure things? Well, I don't know. I mean, one thing I would say is that when I was a student, it was kind of at Cambridge years ago, we did all these kind of fuzzy drawings, you know, atmospheric blurred drawings that were very beautiful, but had nothing to do with the building itself. It was more it was about the drawing more than the building. And now you're getting to the situation, certainly with Midjourney, where you can just do that. If you know how to do the prompts properly, you can just produce something that is incredibly atmospheric, that really it's very, very powerful and gives you that sense that they were talking about, but does it in a way that's what it would really look like in some ways. So you could use this kind of a kind of techniques of drafting, shall we say, to get a more precise understanding what the building would actually look like. I don't know. I'm not sure that quite answered your question, but
I just wanted to follow up briefly. In some of the illustrations that you showed about reality, it actually struck me that if we're at the precipice of AI and quantum computing, that's going to change the paradigm of our own reality. We can dynamically look at data at a far larger scale. How are you predicting, with what you know now, theoretically and scientifically, how should we be adapting or thinking about adapting in the future when it comes to bits and space and our reality?
Well, I mean, you use the word paradigm, and I don't know if that was intentional or not, but of course, Thomas Kuhn was famous for this notion of paradigm. In the sense, what that means, basically, it becomes a different model to explain the world, shall we say, rather than this reality. So, you know, his point is is that as you shift from one paradigm to another, in fact, his notion of the paradigm echoes Foucault's notion of episteme. One way of thinking supersedes another way of thinking. So typically, for example, I mean, Thomas Kuhn talks about how we shifted from Newtonian physics to Einsteinian physics, the physics of Isaac Newton to the physics of Einstein, Albert Einstein. And it's not as though one cancels out the other, it's just that it becomes a different sort of model, a kind of way of thinking. So I guess there's that. I mean, I do think that the notion of the paradigm, therefore, is very relevant as a concept there. I also think that in some senses, what does become clear is how we adopt a certain language to describe what we're doing, often informed by the technologies that we use. So, for example, you know, Walter Benjamin started talking about the camera and about the snapshot and about metaphors to do with, let's say, the flash bulb and so on. And all these kind of permeated his writing. So we actually had a kind of a text called The Snapshot of the Bourgeoisie, as though you incorporate sort of aspects of the technology you're dealing with. And I think to some extent, that also has begun to sort of to infiltrate the way that we think in terms of let's say things like Google, but that becomes a kind of logic that feeds into how we search for information these days. So, you know, I think that these tools will have a huge impact. I know that they are already, right? I mean, I think that the ChatGPT has had a significant impact on, for example, I've got a colleague who works in the Zaha Hadid office in Beijing, Lei Zheng, super talented, but her English is not great. So what she does, I mean, the number of tactics she does using ChatGPT, but she writes something and says to ChatGPT, could you sort that out and turn it to good English? And you get this perfect letter for a client coming out from that. And I think we absorb these things. This is something I want to talk about eventually in the final session, about how we absorb these techniques. They become prosthesis of how we think. And of course, AI is doing that right now, you know, especially if we're using Midjourney. I mean, the comment that I've made in the past is that when we're using, well, the model of the GAN, just to sort of for those who aren't familiar with it, the GAN is the generative adversarial network that was producing the images that we had up until recently as the best, and they've now been superseded by the diffusion model, which is much better. But the GAN had two neural networks. One was generating material, and one was kind of like was a discriminator, was discriminating against that material, deciding whether it was good or not. And in fact, they worked together so that the discriminator trained the generator in order and then force it to improve its act. It would reject anything that wasn't working. Now, that model doesn't apply to the diffusion model, but I think it actually applies to how we operate with diffusion models, because I don't think human beings are that imaginative. I think our range of imagination is kind of limited. So what we get with Midjourney and DALL-E often is a kind of prosthesis, an extension. So it generates much more than we could generate ourselves. And of course, we're very good discriminators. I've often said, smell a cocktail, or smell a perfume, or taste a cocktail, and immediately you know if you like it or not. So I think we are transforming into a kind of into forms of discriminators, and we're relying upon the technology to generate more options so that we can judge and decide which ones we're going to use ourselves. At least that would be my view about how we're adapting to this world. So I think we incorporate and absorb these things, and whatever we find useful. And this is the logic of affordance that J.J. Gibson talks about. There are certain tools that are good for certain things. And what I've discovered, certainly with Midjourney, is that I can't do certain things. I mean, you can see here, this works very well. This is a design for Turrell. And I'm kind of basing on this in the prompt and so on, and it works very well. I never got very far with Sydney Opera House. It just doesn't work on Midjourney. Maybe the prompt was wrong and so on. So forget the Sydney Opera House. I will do this kind of thing. So it tends to sort of, you take the path of least resistance and you do what you can do. And of course, let's think about. I did mention the Sydney Opera House in the talk, and the real problem about the Sydney Opera House is you'll listen to this beautiful sketch. Famously, it had been rejected, but Saarinen saw it among the pile of rejected ones and said, "This is the one we've got to build." But the problem was you've got these curves, and they were just done in the old days. You basically used a French curve or something, and you didn't know what you draw. So the problem for the engineers was that they couldn't work out what it actually was. So they had to reduce it down to segments of the sphere. And if you look at the Sydney Opera House, you can see that actually the vaults of the roof are based on segments of the sphere in order to calculate it. Now we've got computers, we're no longer constrained by that. But before, it was all based on kind of what you could do with parallel motion and so on and so on. So I think these tools open up possibilities and change the forms of expression that we have, and we kind of work with them and see what works for us and so on. And I think that happens. The same happens with an artist, working with a particular brush or a particular pencil or something, or indeed with a sculptor chiseling away at the marble or something. It's based on the affordances, what you can do with a particular kind of materials. And I think these tools allow us certain affordances, and therefore kind of in a very subtle way change the way in which we operate. Maybe that's
Thank you, Neil. You have two questions, one on the chat and one on the Q&A box.
Okay. Yeah, okay. Someone who's listed as an anonymous attendee. In the future, will buildings built through data also have intelligence and thinking to predict the behavior of occupants? I would have said, and I had a discussion with Philip Yuan about this, I don't think material has intelligence as such, even though we use the term, because it takes a certain form, shall we say. If you hang a rope, it'll form a parabola and so on. And I was resisting that. And thinking the two terms there, I think, are really kind of interesting because until about a few weeks ago, I didn't think you could even use those terms for AI, let alone buildings. But now, if a building is equipped with AI, absolutely, I think potentially it has that. And I certainly know that in China there's a company called CityBrain, which, the language they use was to say that buildings can think. Cities can think. In fact, what they're doing is they're using very sophisticated AI to control the traffic. It was, I think, CityBrain is developed by Alibaba, and I forget which city Alibaba is based in, but apparently they used to have terrible traffic problems. And they've used this not only to solve the traffic problems and stop jams, but also if there's an accident, they can use it to to spot where the accident is and send the ambulance or the emergency vehicles there before even they've been requested. So they're using what they're using here, what they call a digital twin. So what happens in real time? You're monitoring things and you're using this to respond in some way. So you're using AI, and they use the term brain. Okay. Is it a brain? I don't know. I think we're getting closer towards that situation. Of course, in buildings themselves, you can also see how the digital twin has been used in terms of optimizing environmental performance. You can use that already. We have Nest thermostats, and we have in China. I'm sure you've got something very similar, which are already kind of using forms of computation to do that. But the idea of a digital twin is actually you can actually monitor in real time and optimize it. So yes, buildings, I think, were absolutely become intelligent. And although I wouldn't have said this before a few weeks ago, I think now, and it takes someone like Geoffrey Hinton, who is an absolute genius, who used this terminology before I would be prepared to use it myself. And it seems that what they're recognizing is this world of AI is coming up with an intelligence that is different to human intelligence, but is superior. So I could see that being embedded everywhere. And of course, there is an issue of AI, architectural intelligence. The journal was based on a book that was produced in which I wrote the introduction, talking about architectural intelligence and looking at the ways in which we use intelligence already. And of course, there are different forms of AI software. Mike Shih, for example, has got a software called Amoeba. Actually, it's very primitive. It's not deep learning. It's very primitive. It's just straightforward topological optimization. But nonetheless, that's been used. We have companies, or there's a group, Austrian Institute of Architects, who are producing software like Infrared that's also using AI and things. So it's been used in the design of the buildings already. And I think we're going to see it in the production of buildings. I mean, it's also to say that I think that one of the important things that's been thrown up by the pandemic has been the importance of interactive design, because we're all operating in spaces that, they can be a living room, they can be a dining room, they can be an office, and we need to think about interactive spaces and how they can mutate and change. So that's again something on the agenda right now. So data, absolutely. Predicting the behavior of occupants. Of course, there's a dark side to that, right? But I think the positive side is when you can use this for certain things, like in China, you can pay for goods. Go to a shop and you can pay for things through facial recognition. Absolutely, no, I think that's correct. Now, there's also a question in the chat, right? 10 new messages. Okay, there's one from Alan Crawford. Thanks, Neil. Do you consider that the theory of the digital world and the idea we exist in a matrix can begin to be correlated to aspects of scientific realities of the quantum world? You've caught me out on a blind spot there. I don't know enough about the quantum world. I wish I did. It'd be good to have a conversation with you about that. I don't know myself enough to talk about that, except to say that some very intelligent people around me are all talking about the quantum world. So I suspect that okay. There was another question in this chat. Did you say, Gustavo?
No, that was the main question. I looked on YouTube. I'll look again.
Okay, but you said there were 3 questions though, right?
No, one from YouTube, Gustavo just posted, and another is in the Q&A box.
Okay. So we've looked at that. Okay. Well, I'm sorry I disappointed that, but there's another one here. Okay. So we've got some more time if we need it. In the session supposedly going on for another 35 minutes or so. So I would just encourage anyone. I mean, what often happens is people are embarrassed or shy to ask them, but they're normally the best questions, the ones that come in at the end, where nobody wants, they're a bit too, everyone's just too shy to ask it. But I mean, those of you who are students, I was a student once. I would make mistakes. So don't worry. There's no question. It's a bad question. It's a question, right? That's all it is. Frankly, today, one of those. Okay, there's a question of the panelists.
Neil, I'm sorry, I had a follow-up question.
Okay, go ahead.
When you actually talked about the idea of reality and architecture and education, can you please clarify your position? Like, what reality are you speaking about when it comes to historical reality, philosophical reality, or does the architectural education need to change to a more scientific paradigm or engineering paradigm? Can you please explain further?
Well, okay. So, I mean, and I think I mentioned there is a material world out there, no question. I mean, I don't buy the kind of the virtual, to some extent, the virtual. Well, I don't know. Maybe maybe I should be more open to that possibility. But I believe there is a material world out there. It's just that whether we only access that through our perceptions. And those perceptions are highly biased and subjective. So, let's say there's, I don't know. Well, exactly. The example, I apologize for using the example I've used so many times before, a kitchen knife, right? Now, somebody who's a chef will say, great, I can chop up vegetables. And someone who's a kind of detective will say, that's the murder weapon, So, all the whole time we are filtering this through our own sort of perception. And often that's controlled. It's controlled. I mean, one of the comments that Louis Althusser comes up is that he talks about how there are two methods of control in society. One is the kind of what he would call the repressive state apparatus, that is to say, the police and the military. And we've seen many countries where there have been clampdowns on people who are protesting in a very kind of violent way, which is a physical way. But there's also something called ideological state apparatus, which is to say our thoughts are being controlled. And that's kind of not so easy to understand. But, frankly, we are conditioned by our background, and it does influence how we think, and that's what they mean by ideology. All everywhere there's a kind of like there's a lens, shall we say, or a filter through which we are engaging with the world, and we are interpreting it. And it's and I think the problem for architectural discourse, and I once wrote about this in the context of Kenneth Frampton, and he was talking about architecture and cultural identity, but he had no mechanism for somehow connecting architecture and cultural identity rather than grafting one onto the other. But if you take the line of people like Homi Bhabha who say, well, it's not just about the object, the building, it's about how we engage with it and interpret it, then you open up a whole sort of realm. And that's a kind of blind spot, I think, for architects. We never really deal with that question well enough. Does that answer the question?
Yes, Neil. I mean, I think my one final follow-up is you talked about the idea of architects struggling with reality. Are you talking about the research that we're doing within the universities, engaging space? Is it about a philosophical understanding, or is it about solving real existential problems as architects so that we can evolve to meet the challenges of today?
Well, I mean, I personally, just from a personal perspective, I find the value of these kind of cultural theory debates and so on, really to do with kind of like understanding the world in which we're operating. It's not, in other words, we begin to understand the cultural conditions in which we are operating and which produces the architecture. So even though it seems to be kind of remote from buildings and construction principles and so on, nonetheless, it gives us some understanding. The building comes out of the context of that, and we always see that, right? I mean, even stylistically, you can kind of see the Baroque coming out of a certain thing. That's I'm trying to think whether this could literally go into this thing, into understanding things. I guess I don't know. In some ways, I also, the back of my mind, I mean, we're talking about David Chalmers today, and I was thinking of another figure who was kind of similar to David Chalmers, Ludwig Wittgenstein, who was a philosopher in Cambridge. David Chalmers was a Rhodes Scholar in Oxford, and he was a mathematician by training. He was a brilliant mathematician. And Wittgenstein was an engineer by training. And, what they kind of, Wittgenstein was, what was interesting about it, he both designed a building for his sister, and also he developed a philosophy, which kind of led towards sort of logical positivism and so on, which is very interesting. And it was almost like his background in engineering, and he was literally an engineer, that allowed him to sort of express things in a different sort of way. But you could see a building coming out of that. So I think we're conditioned by our way of thinking into producing different buildings, for sure. Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm waffling too much there.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So we still have some time for questions. I would love to get some from our Chinese students. I just hope that was intelligible for those who do not have English as a first language. Yeah.
There is one more question.
The second question. Sorry, the second question. I just noticed this. Sorry, I didn't know that. From anonymous attendee. Maybe it's the same person, or maybe everyone's anonymous. Do you have any movie recommendations about the digital design of future architecture, or what directors you admire? That's an interesting question. Well, I'm based in LA. This is Blade Runner country, right? Even though Blade Runner is not a movie about architecture, I mean, there are some buildings in there. There's the Bradbury building in downtown LA that's kind of famous, and there's also a Frank Lloyd Wright building that's used in the building. It somehow is a hugely architectural thing, and I think that was incredibly prescient for many reasons. I don't actually like the second Blade Runner myself so much as the first one, and it was released in 1982. Now, if you think of some of the things that they were predicting, or he was predicting, and I'm just blanking on the Ridley Scott was also British, was the director. And he was predicting a number of different things happened in that movie. I mean, there were things like, there was and I'm also blanking on the name of the main replicant, who was able to play chess incredibly well. And he beat Eldon Tyrell, who was this genius engineer, scientist who had developed these replicants. Replicants were they were kind of bioengineered robots, shall we say, hugely sophisticated. And of course, so there was the chess, first of all, that was, and Gary Kasparov didn't lose to AI until 1997. So this was 15 years before that, predicting that AI would be good at chess. And of course, it's brilliant at Go, as anybody in China knows, because the AlphaGo has become a kind of a very famous story there. But there was that. But also, what I find interesting was the idea that this guy Eldon Tyrell. But if you producing robots, well, if you change the name from Eldon to Elon, you've got Elon, and Elon Musk is of course producing robots. But even the kind of the vision of the city, I thought was amazing. I mean, in the sense that it was predicting a world in which we were kind of dominated by corporate culture. It was a Tyrell corporation then, but now, of course, it's kind of certainly in the West, it's kind of like Google, Amazon, Microsoft, eBay, whatever. But in China, there is equal number of Alibaba, Weibo, and I don't know what. There's a whole bunch of Didi and so on. So it was predicting a world in which we're dominated by corporate culture. It was predicting a world where we had images on buildings, and of course Shanghai is even more extraordinary than any glimpse of any image from Blade Runner, and so on. So I think that was a movie that I thought was incredibly interesting in all sorts of different sort of ways, and it also, the comment that was made, now I'm blanking again on his name, by the guy who played the lead replicant after the movie, and he said basically this was a movie, it wasn't about replicants, it was about what it is to be human. And I think that, to my mind, was also hugely influential for me, is that actually almost this technology becomes a mirror in which to understand how we operate. Now, I think that's what really is very clear about Geoffrey Hinton, who is kind of like looking to AI to understand how the human brain works. And I think that's something also that I find astonishing. So that would, the Blade Runner movie, I don't think that necessarily movies with about architects are so interesting, but when architecture kind of enters in, yeah, that would be my recommendation. But I would say just maybe one thing, just the thing about future architecture. I guest edited an issue of Architectural Design, 2009, I think it was, and it was called Digital Cities. And it was about basically what will the city of the future look like. And what was interesting is that almost all the architects, were talking about, well, this is the form it'll have, and so on and so on. Patrick Schumacher, where he first launched his notion of parametricism, 2009. It comes from that. And he was talking about how the city of the future will be parametric, and so on and so on and so on. We haven't seen a parametric city. We haven't seen anything like that. But what we have seen is something that's much closer to what Ben Bratton was saying. And Ben Bratton wrote an article called iPhone City, in which he was saying that the iPhone was change the way in which we operate in the city, and was totally allowed us to, for example, to use the car as the office. Well, I don't think you can check your text, your iPhone, your phone anymore. It'll be banned. But that's an interesting kind of concept. And he wrote this in 2009. Well, at least the manuscript was delivered in 2008, and that was a year before Uber. In other words, he was predicting that the car could become your place of work. And that was important, that he could recognize that. But the important thing he was saying was that it was informational systems that would be the driving force in the future of the city. And I don't think the city of the future is going to look so different to the future of today. Of course, there will be a few new buildings, but most cities are, frankly, haven't got much space for new buildings, and it doesn't make economic sense to demolish buildings, and so on and so on and so on. So I don't think that the city of the future is going to look so different to the city of today, but it will be informed by informational systems. I mentioned the digital twin for the heating and the environmental control and the traffic and so on. I think that is going to be how the city is going to operate. So nothing futuristic. It's not going to look like something out of the the Jetsons. Nothing like Jetsons thing. It's not going to be this high tech thing. It's going to be look pretty much the same. A lot of buildings are going to be pretty old fashioned in some senses. That would be my view. So now we leave the time. Still got potentially another 20 minutes. But I don't think we necessarily need to draw it out if it's going to take too long. Yeah, it's good to see Imam Sheikh Ansari here. It's good to have Iranians here. Salam. Okay. So, yeah. New message. Yeah. Well, I think so.
Neil, there's a few questions on YouTube. Let me post let me post some.
Oh, one's from Angela. Thank you. Thank you. Amazingly, thank you. Okay, so I can't even pronounce his name. Jacek Zukowski. I assume that might be Polish, but Polish people are asleep now. So either you got up. Okay. There are two questions, or is it one question? Considering these new tools that can augment our power to predict and simulate the use of space, do you see it as the architect having a new type of agency over the user of the buildings, or just an augmentation of our power to imagine? Let me read that again. Considering these new tools can augment our power to predict and simulate the use of space, do you see it as the architect having a new type of agency over the user of the buildings, or just an augmentation of our power to imagine? Well, I don't think the architect's got no control about anything anyway. I think that's a bit of a myth. It's, you know, there's a very famous essay by Foucault where he says the architect's got no control over me. No, if the architect designs a wall, I can demolish it, assuming it stands up structurally. I can do that. The architect doesn't have a control of me. So I think that's, you know, we have a view that we're trained to think, but, you know, certainly I was at Cambridge. They would tell us about Le Corbusier and his Promenade Architecturale, and the Promenade Architectural means how a person would navigate the building, and that's what the building would allow you to do. But actually, that doesn't control the people. They can do what they want. So I'm not so convinced of that. Well, I think that the augmentation of our power to imagine, I think, well, what's going to happen, this is turning into a lecture about AI, a discussion about AI, is that, you know, what we've seen at the moment is just the tip of the iceberg, right? I mean, what we can't see, because it's, as it were, below water, or rather it's under development, is the software that's about to come out in about 3 years' time that will radically change how we operate in the future. So, you know, I think at the moment, all we have is these tools, which are frankly, you know, good for sketching. You know, I think that Patrick Schumacher talked about how you'd use Midjourney and DALL-E in the office to what he called ideate, to basically brainstorm possibilities. So certainly it can do that. But I think it's important to sort of see this within a kind of historical trajectory. In other words, things will change. And that historical trajectory is based on exponential development. There's a theory called Moore's law, which basically was saying that the way that things develop, and it wasn't a theory, it was just an observation initially by Gordon Moore, who was an industrialist, and he noticed that the number of transistors on a circuit board would double every 2 years, and the price would come down by half, which means that change is exponential. It's not just 1, 2, 3, 4, it's 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, which is radical. And that's what we're seeing now. It's been Ray Kurzweil said that principle applies to the whole of technology. Everything is basically getting more and more powerful and becoming cheaper and cheaper. Moore's law supposedly was never going to hold out forever. Just recently, we've seen in the realm of AI that it is doing that. So in other words, you know, I think it's really a question of when we talk about these things, when, you know, and what is so interesting is that people have been predicting when. There's a book that came out called Architects of Intelligence, and I'm blanking now on the name of the editor, but he it doesn't mean architecture at all, it means computer architectures, and he interviewed a whole group of leading figures about certain questions, like when would this be, when would the so-called singularity be, and when would we reach superintelligence, and so on. And you've got a vast range of approaches, and in fact, one prediction was it wouldn't be till 2099, went a long way off. But what is so interesting is things are happening now. People are changing their prediction. We saw that with Geoffrey Hinton. He had said, well, I don't think it's going to happen in 2030. Now it's happening right now. And I think this is the kind of the scary thing, is the speed at which it's happening. So, who knows what's going to happen in the future, but all I can say, it's going to happen sooner than you thought. And I think AI is going to be an enormously powerful tool. Yeah, Martin Ford's the author. That's right. Architects of Intelligence. enormously powerful tool that will be able to do all sorts of things. And you know, it's interesting just in terms of a timeline how long this has been going on, right? I can recall back in 2019, I teamed up with Zaha Hadid Architects and with Refik Anadol and with Jane Burry and a few others, you know, to propose the British Pavilion for the Venice Biennale. And we were sponsored by Google. Unbelievable. Sponsored by Google. This was a dream team. I know Patrick can be controversial sometimes. Maybe it wasn't the dream team. But anyway, it was I thought it was a dream team. And we weren't even shortlisted. Nobody was paying attention to this. And now, in the space of 4 years, everyone's talking about AI. Now, that just shows you the remarkable pace of change. You know, and of course, whatever we see now, we might be amazed by it, but we're going to be amazed by something in the future that's going to be really, really blowing us about. I mean, so that's the kind of the concern is that where is it going in the future? And for me, as someone who's publishing things, and I just want to mention that there is a book, my first book on AI is coming out in Chinese. It's taking a long time, but it's going to come out in Chinese eventually, hopefully. That's out of date before I publish it. And in fact, so far I've been kind of thinking quite grateful because it means I can get some better illustrations in there. But it's bound to be out of date when it comes out. So who knows? I don't want to predict anything, but I just say that it's kind of scary how capable this thing is. What can architects do to keep up with this change? Yeah. What can you leave the students with? Well, okay, just that's a good comment. Thanks. The students. Well, first of all, I think, well, there's actually an article that's going to come out in ArchiNect on Monday, an interview where I'm talking about the future of architecture and the future of education. There is a dark side to all this, which no architect has seemed to be addressing. Matthias Del Campo even said that those who talk about the dark side of losing jobs and things, they don't understand. They don't know much about AI. Well, actually, I'm sorry, but Geoffrey Hinton does know about AI, and more than any architectural commentator. And seriously, we have to worry about the fact it's going to happen. There are going to be changes, fundamental changes, and it's important for students to be aware of those changes. Now, I'm not sure what the solution is. But at least if you're aware of a problem, it becomes a different kind of problem. It's something you can think about rather than address. But for sure, you know, we're going into a future where we simply cannot survive without AI. And if you're not equipped with it, you're not going to survive. And there are a number of issues in history. So when I was a student, we were banned from using computers in the studio. That was Delano Mulvaney for you. The University of Cambridge, very conservative in many ways. And actually, the good students would just draw anyway on a computer, and then they would do a kind of overlay sketch hand drawing, and they would pass. And the bad students would do it by hand, but they would end up unemployable. You simply couldn't get a job in the office unless you could use certain technologies. In fact, I recall talking to Foreign Office architects. That was Alejandro Zaro Polo in the days when they existed. And this was like 2000. They said, we can't employ anybody over the age of 40 because they can't use the software. So what I would say is find out about these things, you know, invest in these things. And especially, you know, I think there's a generation coming out, and you can see this on the Digital Futures series that we had a few months ago in February, March. We had these super geeks coming out who were George Gieler and so on, really, really smart individuals. Daniel Escobar, and there's a whole group of them, you know, well, there aren't many, there's a handful of them, but they are experimenting with these technologies, and they're the ones who are going to be employable in the future. If you can handle this, people need people in the office who can do this. No, I know these tools everyone can use them, but if you're going to use it in a really intelligent way, you've got to know how to get underneath it and make it work for you, which means being like Daniel Bollinger. I don't know if you know Daniel Bollinger, but he is the great genius of AI in architecture in the world, and you've got to be like that. There's Randy Deutsch in his book talks about he has a book called Super Users, and I'm not quite sure whether I'm talking about the same thing as he's talking about, but I would say if you want to make yourself employable, you've got to understand how to use these technologies and be useful. So for sure, there's a saying that said that basically those who use AI will replace those who don't use AI. Well, it's kind of weird because nobody's going to be able to avoid AI. So, I mean, but certainly you need to find out about AI, and you need to work with it, because it's necessary. That's the advice I'd give, is find out about it. If you can't beat them, join them. Yeah. This wasn't meant to be a lecture about AI, but there we go. There we go.
You have a question in the Q&A, Neil.
Okay. The environment can influence people's behavior. Can you imagine how buildings of different cultures affect each other? How buildings of different cultures affect each other. I'm not quite sure what that means. No, I'm not quite sure about that. How to answer that. The environment can influence people's behavior. Can you imagine how buildings of different cultures affect each other? No, I'm not sure what that means, unless anyone can explain that to me. How do buildings affect each other? I'm not sure they do. No, my apologies for that one. Okay. Well, I guess we can call a halt to it now. I see the general direction is going away from the philosophy towards AI. Let me see if that's going to happen tomorrow as well. But no, I want to leave you with that thought at the very beginning, because I think that is, and I haven't really thought it through enough myself. But I noticed that Yukui has been writing about this, and I think people are beginning to realize they've got to radically. I think the world of philosophy is going to come to terms with something that is, so Geoffrey Hinton was once asked, well, what do you think this new world is? How would you compare it? And he said, well, it's maybe like the invention of electricity. It's maybe like the invention of the wheel. I think actually it's more than that. I think it's not about an invention of something. It's about us as human beings having our role redefined. Now, that is something that is humbling in some ways. We have to recognize this. In my own work, I think that I made this kind of comment that there's a Polish guy, Nicholas Copernicus, right? You all know about him. He talks about how we need to rethink how the universe operates. And it's not the universe revolving around the Earth. It's the Earth revolving around the sun, and so on. I think we have to step aside of our prejudices and really think, how we are no longer the center of intellectual life. We are no longer the smartest entities in the universe, and we have got to come to terms with that. And the real problem is that this is racing away. AI is racing away. It must see us like a dumb animal right now. It must think these people are primitive. And we can't even understand what it's thinking because it's beyond our spectrum. I will just leave you with that kind of the idea that what's happening now in AI is beyond our spectrum of capability, a little like the way that a dog can smell or hear more than we can as humans. We can't even smell the smells that dogs can smell or the sounds that they can hear. This is what's going to happen in the future. We're going to be lost. So we've got to prepare for that and reconcile us to that. That's why I'm saying that we have to really kind of have this notion of a second Copernican revolution and recognize that our role in the universe has fundamentally changed. I think I would go further than Geoffrey Hinton in saying this is actually an existential crisis. I don't think the danger of AI is hopefully it won't get out of control. It won't finish us off, but it's going to make the human race feel very different. I don't know what's going to happen, but we must be aware of that possibility. So I'm going to leave it like that, and we'll catch up tomorrow. So tomorrow, aestheticization. It's a very awkward term, but it's a very interesting term. And I'm going to talk less about technology tomorrow and more about the role of images in architectural culture and what they have and the negative side of them in some senses. And I want to mention NEOM, this very problematic project, The Line in Saudi Arabia, towards the end. So anyway, thank you for listening. Last question. Okay. Where?
It's by Louis Hui. Can you talk about the homogenization in architecture these days may be worse in our AI future?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think we'll talk about that in terms of imitation of things, that people somehow think that AI is going to be is copying things, and therefore we're copying existing things, therefore it'd be more of the same. I don't think that is the case at all. That's people like Mario Carpo, who talks nonsense, frankly, say these things. Not the way it is. I think what's going to happen is the opposite, actually, is that the possibilities, if you can use, certainly, I mean, if you use cycle GANs, you're breeding something off against something else. So you could, let's say, take the work of Zaha Hadid and breed that off against orchids, and you could produce Zaha-like orchids or orchid-like architectural designs, whatever. That's already possible. I'm finding this in terms of Midjourney and well, I use Midjourney, that if you include in the prompt something else, you get the most astonishing things. It opens up possibilities. It doesn't close them down. In any case, and we'll mention this again 2 lectures time, it doesn't just imitate the past. I mean, I did a whole series of projects based on the Barcelona Pavilion by Mies van der Rohe. Not when I think I had about 5,000 outcomes, maybe more. I don't know. Huge number. I never at any point ever got anything that actually resembled the Barcelona Pavilion. In other words, it doesn't copy. It opens it up. It offers a range of different things, and I'm not that concerned. There's also something here right at the very end. From Alan Crawford, algorithms like Midjourney are mainly used to develop phantasmagorical images that flood social media. Can you envisage soon they will be used to solve global issues such as homelessness? Right. Yes. I mean, I think the problem with architects is that we're so obsessed by images, literally so obsessed by images. So the first books on AI, no one really was convinced by them because the images which were generated by GANs weren't really that good. But suddenly Midjourney's producing some good stuff. And I think there's a lot of very bad stuff that's produced by Midjourney, and because it's own biases. And when you're using Midjourney, I think the challenge is to overcome those biases and not fall into that trap. So I think you've got to be careful about that. But we're obsessed by images, and that's a problem, because actually buildings aren't just about images; they're about processes, they're about performance, and they're about issues such as you say, global homelessness. All I would say is that we have to look beyond the tools like Midjourney and think about what is generating that. And Midjourney is just an outcome of the GPT logic, and it's simply somebody recognizing which works with words. And they recognize you can connect words with images via captions, right? So it produces something. But I think the problem is architects get lost in the world of images, look at the system themselves, and they can be used. And I want to say is that they're super intelligent, super intelligent. So they can address those questions. I mean, at a very basic level, I mean, you go to ChatGPT and say, well, just ask it a question. How do you solve the issues of homelessness? And it'll come up with 10 ideas. That's what we've got today. But I tell you, in a few months' time, we'll be blown away by it. And so absolutely. I think that I agree that there's some of these images of phantasmagorical. What I would say, though, is that even though they're phantasmagorical and they're just sketches, they give us a glimpse of the potential of AI, because the quality of the rendering, and literally last week, somebody put one of my images onto an Instagram image. I put it on Instagram, and if you want to follow some of my images there, my Instagram thing is Neil Leach, one word, NEILLEACH 14, and they put it up there and said, "Do you think this is a rendering, a photograph, or AI generated?" And most people thought it was AI. It was a rendering or photograph. We can already see the potential of these tools. They are mind blowing. They are mind-blowing. Now, that's just images. So just think, if that kind of intelligence, which is growing exponentially almost every day, is applied to the context of homelessness, of course it will be able to solve those problems. Of course. I mean, having said all that, I think one of the real problems about these technologies is that certain people benefit, the rich, the big companies benefit, but the poor don't. So so maybe it's also going to work against it in some ways, but potentially could solve any problem. So let's wrap things up. Thank you for the questions. Could I maybe put down a kind of challenge to all the Chinese students who typically don't ask many questions to try and really ask something next time around, which would be great. And we have it's 2.25 hours. It's quite a long time. So let's try and get some. Please feel free to ask questions. I don't want to kind of like put you on the spot, but feel free to use this opportunity to ask questions. Anyway, so thanks for the feedback. This is going to be uploaded onto YouTube, I hope, and I will see you guys tomorrow. Thank you for the team that put this together. Thank you for the team in Shanghai setting this up. Thank you for the main Digital Futures team for the posters and things. And see you guys tomorrow. Stop sharing. Bye.